I start my paper. My paper is about the protests that were held in Delhi and other parts of the country against the farm laws that were enacted earlier this year. Last year, and then the protests were held earlier this year, even till now, like a few weeks ago. My project basically surveys and studies linguistic landscape of a protest space, of a dissent space that enacts in different ways in which language can be observed, language is seen, and how linguistic spaces and linguistic landscapes are created in themselves. So basically, research in linguistic landscape recognizes signages, both language and content of the signage in forms of language of the signage in the form of, say, boards, placards, posters, or the slogans that are uttered in protests, etc. Usually, these represent both top-down policy manifestations in terms of what policy has been generated by the government or what kind of law has been given out by the government, etc., as well as bottom-up instances of, say, compliance, contestation, and conflict and dissent that the people usually express against the government, against the policy, against the law. Through these language-based signages, usually the dissenters, the people who protest, create a dynamic, mobile, and dialectic space that questions the dominance and the power that is present in the specific scenario, especially with respect to the scene that is created because of the space. With language and science and the presence of language-based science, the language becomes a productive of a social process which acts as sites, because now language plays such an important role in these sites of protest, in these sites of social change, in these sites of social dynamic situations. The language also in turn acts as a medium of dissent. And the language helps in identity construction and representation per se. So these places, they become places of affect where the linguistic landscape not only manifests the tensions between the hegemony in this case, in my case, would be, say, the laws that were enacted specifically which were harming the farmers in a very real manner that was not accepted, or at least not acknowledged in a proper way, and the fight for rights by the local communities, that was the dissent by the farmers, especially in big areas or in smaller places. So this becomes a performance that is dually authored by the creator, who is the person who is taking part in the protest, taking part in the linguistic landscape itself. That is, the people in this situation, it would be the people who were taking part in the protest, who were actively protesting, who were stakeholders because they were affected by the farm laws, the farmers, and also the onlookers who were looking at the protest, who were, even if they were a part of the protest, they were not exact first stakeholders, who were not affected by the farm law in such a strong way as the others. Therefore, examination of such protest spaces is extremely important. In my paper, I addressed two questions, which is, how is participation in dissent through this linguistic landscape enacted per se, and what effect does this mode of protest have on the onlookers then? Because people's perceptions are intertwined with these protests, with their pre-existing conceptions of democracy or of how protest is a fundamental right and should be a fundamental right, while it sometimes is not. So through my paper, I explain first what is a linguistic landscape. A linguistic landscape specifically, according to LNL experts, is a space where there is a manifestation of policy, especially where dissidents create a dynamic, movable, and dialectic space that challenges this domination and authority through the use of logographic and language-based signage. Because the signage in this particular situation was in the form of boards, was in the form of slogans, was in the form of the posters that the protesters hold or were holding, especially in this situation, it becomes even more important to see what kind of analysis is being done, what languages are being used. Is the language of the protester predominantly being used, or is a dominant language such as a dominant language which is used in a large part of the country being used, or English being used per se, or is there a specific need to use English to be heard further? So as noted by CIIL's, Korean CIIL's, who is a widely known linguistic landscape scholar, the rising recognition of linguistic landscape's complexity in studies has prompted academics to consider the linguistic landscape's nature. As this has been widely documented, early linguistic landscapes research focused on LL as a static entity composed of written texts in the public domain that could be documented once via pictures and then quantitatively evaluated to examine instances of language dominance. In this manner, when this research and when this proposition in itself plays out in the situation that I have selected, which is that of the farmers' protest and the dissent that was being characterized through the protests, it can be seen that once the pictures of the protest itself are, say, collated and collected, pictures of the protest are collated and collected, there is documentation of how the protest is taken, how the protest has been held, of what language the protesters are using when they are writing on the signboards or when they are chanting some slogans against the government, especially when there is like high-powered activity, functioning energy in the protest space itself. It is important to check what is happening. Language in itself shows what kind of dominance exists, which communities or which languages dominate over others, and which language policies are being used, or which language policies and their manifestations are being shown in a specific dissent area per se. So while we think of a protest space as a space where there is dissent, where dissent is being characterized through the protest, through the very act of blocking a certain area, through the very act of peacefully showing that people are against something that is affecting them, something that is affecting their lives and livelihoods and their families, is being characterized in a manner that language in itself, that the language that they use in showing such kind of dissent also becomes a very important factor per se, because of the linguistic landscape that is being created. Because once you see that the language a person uses in a protest, the language one uses in a protest may or may not necessarily be the language that they use at home. It may be a language that they necessarily are using for themselves to be heard and understood by a larger number of people, to be heard and understood by the police, to be heard and understood by the state. So while we see that people have a right to protest and we see that the right to protest is being used and exercised in the country, what we do not see is how language in itself becomes something that becomes a silent actor and a silent tool which helps to perpetuate a certain degree of hegemony, and it helps people to dominate over certain other groups. And this could be very easily seen in the linguistic landscape that was created in the protest space. So I will specifically examine in just one or two lines shortly to explain what the linguistic landscape was like, and what are the studies that I've used to, what are the frameworks that I've just examine and analyze the setting and the site or the landscape. So the landscape of the site was basically, as I mentioned, was that of the protest landscape, specifically in Delhi, in the sites of Tikri, Singhu and Ghazipur, which was in the outskirts of Delhi. The site of during the protest, the demonstrators basically blocked a number of borders, including the Kundli border and the Dhansa border. The protests started on 29th of November, and the protests started on the 29th of November, and they announced their intention to close specific entry points into Delhi, including Ghazipur Hapur. This culminated in some kind of skirmishes with the police involving violence on the police's part, including stone pelting and lathi charges, and even early in 2021 and in January 2021 and February 2021, metal barriers were used, steel cement walls were erected, and iron nails were there along the highways leading to three main borders to prevent vehicles from entering. This was by the protesters themselves. Additionally, barbed wires were erected to prevent pedestrians from entering Delhi per se. This is to show the kind of dissent and prevent social activity, so as to show their dissent and their anger and how their lives are affected, and there needs to be action, and there has to be some action so as to help them out. The farmers in these protests usually used very vivid forms of expression in terms of the posters that they used, in terms of words that they used, in terms of pictures that they used in posters, which were not necessarily words all the time. There were pictures of people. There was a picture of somebody stamping on a bag of something. There was a bag of something with a picture of the Prime Minister on top of it, and one person specifically stamping on the picture itself, expressing dissent in a manner that is even beyond language, that is characterized in the form of the sign that is being used, in the form of the manifestation of such stamping, and what it means for somebody, for the kind of anger that is being exuded and shown kind of in such a scenario. So while these forms were vivid forms of expression that have been amply recorded and documented by news media organizations and other people working individually in understanding dissent, a fundamental right guaranteed to the people of the country. Now, this site of protest not only bore witness to the activities of the protesters, in which they sort of expressed their dissatisfaction with the laws, there was also there was documentation of all the protest signs, etc. The latter is only visible through pictures and not through any kind of reportage that showed the views of the protesters in a way that would show the kind of agony that they were in. So my literature review basically focuses on the fact that LNL is acknowledged to comprise of traditional texts and any spoken communication, visual and moving images, emblems, etc. But these numerous studies lead to a growing interest in the intersections of linguistic landscape and geosemiotics. Semiotics in themselves show that there is a very great intersection of how language is played out in multiple scenarios and linguistic landscapes, and visibly possible and visibly shown through different kind of approaches and frameworks. But in protest spaces, in something as dynamic as farmers' protests, in something as effective, dynamic and revolutionarily important for the country, the linguistic landscape and the intersection of language and the need for the language per se was of such relevance, was of such eminence, and is something that is not possibly examined at any level at all. So while the linguistic landscape of a protest is a temporal space, in the present case, it even sometimes boiled down to the point of gaining lesser and lesser attention of the onlookers because of the fact that they were being diverted, they were being distracted, they were being diverted to other things, or farmers' protests were just not getting covered after a certain while. It is one that characterizes how dissent works in a democracy, how the language of dissent is different for people, and how this language also characterizes hegemony and rights of the people, and how people ask for their own rights and fight for their own rights and exercise their rights. It generally characterizes how dissent works in a democracy and how it can be enacted despite no seeming results sometimes. While there were results of the farmers' protest, while there was repealing of the law in the end, it is something mass-scale events presented in such a manner, especially a protest, etc., is something that is usually regarded as something which may or may not have an end. So whatever was at the helm of affairs and the attainment of the result may have been something else. The protest, that is the victory announcement of the repealing, is still important to note. And the boards that the protesters held and the slogans they sang, the walls they painted, and the people they made an impact on will still live on and shape the country's politics and ideology and the language the country speaks and the language that people of the country speak in like. It will still live on even if the issues of the farmer fade away or not. So it is important to examine it despite the fact that it is something that is under-examined to a very large extent. Thank you. With that, I conclude my presentation.